Yes, sir. Enough to know you are about to lose $90 million. The room went still before anyone understood why. On the third floor of the Mariner House, a private dining room overlooked Boston Harbor through tall windows framed in dark wood and brass. Outside, the water moved under a pale afternoon sky. Inside, everything was polished, expensive, and controlled. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, silver coffee service. Men in tailored suits speaking in quiet voices about money most people would never see in a lifetime. Claire Bennett moved between them with a tray balanced in one hand and a coffee pot in the other. She was 28, white, and dressed in the clean uniform of the restaurant staff. White shirt, black vest, black apron, tied neatly at her waist. Her blonde hair was pinned back without a loose strand. Her expression was calm, not empty, soft, not weak. She noticed everything. Which guest had not touched his water? Which attorney kept checking the clock? Which cup needed refilling before the hand reached for it? Most people called that service. Claire called it survival. At the head of the table sat Nathan Whitmore, 44 years old, white, wealthy, and used to rooms adjusting themselves around his silence. His charcoal suit fit like it had been made for a man who never waited in line. His watch caught the light every time he moved his hand over the stack of documents in front of him. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When Nathan looked at someone, they either spoke faster or stopped speaking completely. Claire approached his place setting and poured fresh coffee without interrupting the discussion. "The reserve line is already adjusted," one man said. "The banks are comfortable." Another man tapped the folder. "We close before 4 o'clock. We lock the terms." Nathan nodded once. "Then we do not waste time." His voice was smooth, final. Claire set a small coffee receipt near the edge of the table, next to a leather folder and a sheet of projected numbers half covered by Nathan's phone. The receipt was ordinary, thin white paper. A few coffees, a lunch service charge, a handwritten correction across the subtotal where the printer had faded. Claire's eyes touched it for only a second. Then her gaze moved, almost unwillingly, to the larger numbers on the page beside it. She did not lean in. She did not stare. She simply paused. Half a breath. Nathan saw it. His eyes sharpened. "Is there a problem with the coffee?" Claire looked up. "No, sir." "Then why are you looking at my numbers?" The conversation slowed around them. A few executives glanced over with faint amusement. Claire kept the coffee pot steady. "I was not trying to read anything, sir." Nathan's mouth formed something close to a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Good. Because this is not a diner receipt." A soft laugh moved through the room. Claire did not lower her head. She only placed the coffee pot back on the tray. Nathan studied her for another second, already deciding what she was. A server. Background. Someone who carried things for people who made decisions. Then he asked, cold enough for everyone to hear, "Can you even count?" The laugh came again, smaller this time. Claire's fingers rested lightly against the tray. Her face did not change. Not embarrassment. Not anger. Not fear. Her eyes moved once to the small receipt on the table, then back to Nathan. And the strange thing was, she looked less like a woman being insulted than someone hearing a mistake repeat itself. The laughter faded, but the feeling it left behind remained in the room. Claire Bennett stood exactly where she was, her black apron perfectly straight, the silver tray balanced against her hip. Around the table, several executives exchanged amused looks before returning to their documents. To them, the moment was already over. A billionaire had made a joke. A waitress had become the joke. Business would continue. Nathan Whitmore picked up his pen and glanced back at the acquisition packet spread before him. "Thank you," he said, without looking at her. It sounded less like gratitude and more like a dismissal. Claire nodded politely. "Of course, sir." She turned toward the door. Behind her, one of the investors chuckled. "You have to admit, Nathan, that was a good one." Another smiled. "Maybe we should have her audit the deal while she is here." More quiet laughter followed. Claire kept walking. She had learned years ago that some people laughed because they were amused. Others laughed because they were relieved the attention was not on them. Outside the room, the heavy wooden door closed behind her. The hallway felt cooler, quieter. She released a slow breath and continued toward the service station. The folded order slips, reservation lists, and printed receipts waiting there felt far more familiar than a room full of executives discussing nine-figure transactions. Yet even as she organized glassware and checked table assignments, her thoughts drifted back to the private dining room. Not to Nathan, not to the joke, to the numbers. A few minutes later, Richard Lawson, the restaurant manager, approached. "What happened upstairs?" Claire looked up. "Nothing important." Richard folded his arms. "When wealthy people start laughing during a closing meeting, it is usually important." Claire smiled faintly. "Everything is fine." Richard studied her expression. "Just stay focused on your tables. Those guests are not interested in conversations." The warning was gentle but clear. "Know your place." Claire nodded. "I understand." Before Richard walked away, his eyes briefly landed on the small duplicate receipt she was holding. "You checking totals again?" Claire looked down. A subtotal had been corrected by hand near the bottom. "Just making sure the numbers match." Richard laughed. "You always do." An hour passed. The meeting upstairs continued. Coffee requests increased. Tension often made people thirsty. Claire returned to the private dining room carrying a fresh pot and several bottles of sparkling water. The atmosphere had changed. Earlier there had been confidence. Now there was urgency. One executive was reviewing spreadsheets on a tablet. Another was speaking faster than before. Nathan remained composed, but his attention seemed sharper, more focused. As Claire refilled glasses, she noticed something unusual. The same projection sheet remained partly visible beneath Nathan's phone. Most people would have shifted papers dozens of times by now, yet that page had not moved. Her eyes touched it for only an instant. Nothing more. Across the table, Nathan noticed. Again. This time, he did not speak immediately. He simply watched. "Market closes in less than 2 hours," one advisor said. "We should finalize." Nathan nodded. "Agreed." Then his gaze returned briefly to Claire. She was already stepping away. Calm, silent, unbothered. Most people became nervous around wealth. Claire seemed to become more attentive. That difference bothered him more than he wanted to admit. As she reached the door, another executive called after her jokingly. "Hey, Claire!" She paused. "Yes, sir?" The man grinned. "If you are so good with numbers, tell us whether we should buy the company." A few people smiled. Claire looked at him politely. Then her eyes shifted toward the papers on the table, just for a second. "I do not know if you should buy it," she said softly. "I only know somebody is counting something differently." The room went quiet. Nathan's pen stopped moving. And for the first time that afternoon, nobody laughed. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt longer. Claire Bennett stood near the doorway with her tray balanced against her side while the executives around the table exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody knew whether to laugh anymore. The joke had stopped being funny the moment she answered. Nathan Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair and studied her face. Most people changed when challenged. They became defensive, embarrassed, eager to explain themselves. Claire did none of those things. She simply waited. "What does that mean?" one investor finally asked. Claire looked at him politely. "Probably nothing." A few people relaxed. "Probably?" Another man said. "That is not exactly reassuring." Claire offered a small smile. "Neither is signing something you have not questioned." The room grew quiet again. Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly. It was not the answer itself that caught his attention. It was the way she delivered it, calmly, as though she had spent time around discussions that sounded very different from a restaurant dining room. Richard Lawson appeared in the doorway a few moments later, carrying updated invoices for the event. The manager's face tightened the instant he sensed tension in the room. "Everything all right?" Nathan nodded without looking away from Claire. "Perfectly." Richard glanced toward Claire. "Miss Bennett has tables waiting downstairs." The message was clear. "Return to work." Claire nodded and left without argument. As the door closed behind her, conversation slowly resumed. Yet Nathan found himself paying less attention to the acquisition and more attention to a question he could not answer. Why had she looked at those numbers the way an analyst would? Downstairs, Claire returned to the service station. The afternoon crowd was beginning to arrive. Orders appeared. Glasses needed polishing. Guests requested window seating. Life continued. Yet, while organizing receipts, she paused briefly when she saw a subtotal written in fading blue ink. Not because the amount mattered, because it reminded her of something. For a moment, she saw another table, another stack of papers, a yellow legal pad covered in calculations, a man's hand crossing out a number and writing it again. Then, the memory vanished. Claire folded the receipt and placed it beneath the register. "You always double-check everything," one of the servers said. Claire shrugged. "Habit. You act like numbers can hurt people." Claire looked down for a second. "Sometimes they do." The server laughed softly, assuming it was a joke. Claire did not. An hour later, she returned upstairs with fresh coffee. The meeting had become more intense. Jackets were off. Sleeves were rolled up. Several spreadsheets now covered the table. One attorney was reviewing supporting schedules, while another spoke with someone on speakerphone. Nathan listened quietly. Then a voice crackled through the phone. The reserve adjustment was rolled into the annual exposure estimate. Claire's hand stopped for half a second while placing a cup on the table. Barely noticeable. Barely visible. Except Nathan saw it. Again. His eyes followed her. The room continued talking. Nobody else reacted. Claire resumed, moving normally. Yet Nathan could not ignore what he had just witnessed. She had reacted before anyone else in the room seemed interested in the sentence. Before leaving, Claire picked up an empty glass. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the same projection sheet beneath Nathan's phone. Then she looked away. Nathan finally spoke. "Miss Bennett." She stopped. "Yes, sir?" The room turned toward them. Nathan held her gaze for several seconds. "You knew something was wrong before you ever looked at the total, did you not?" For the first time all afternoon, the confidence in his voice carried something new. Doubt. The question lingered over the room long after Nathan Whitmore asked it. Claire Bennett remained standing beside the table, one hand resting lightly on the silver tray. Around her, attorneys reviewed documents, investors checked projections, and assistants quietly moved papers from one end of the table to the other. Yet beneath the activity, something had shifted. Nathan no longer looked at her the way he looked at the other staff. He was watching, measuring, trying to understand why a waitress kept noticing things that highly paid professionals ignored. Claire met his gaze calmly. "I do not know what is wrong," she said. "I only know something feels different." One executive smiled skeptically. Different is not exactly a financial term. A few people nodded. Nathan did not. He reached for the glass of water beside him and slowly turned it in his hand. "What feels different?" Claire hesitated. The pause seemed to frustrate everyone except Nathan. "I cannot explain it," she said softly. "Not yet." The answer irritated several people immediately. One attorney closed a folder. "Then we are wasting time." Another executive checked his watch. The market would close in less than 2 hours. Every minute carried pressure. Every delay carried cost. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. She understood what they saw when they looked at her. An employee. A server. Someone who should be carrying coffee instead of uncertainty into a room where millions of dollars were being discussed. Richard appeared near the doorway again, visibly uncomfortable. He wanted the situation to disappear. He wanted the meeting to return to normal. Yet normal no longer seemed available. Nathan looked toward the projection sheet, partially hidden beneath his phone. Then, toward the small restaurant receipt, still resting near the edge of the table. Neither object meant anything by itself, yet somehow their presence in the same room continued to bother him. "Continue," he said quietly. Claire glanced at the papers. "There is a pattern." One of the investors laughed softly. "A pattern?" Claire nodded. "Maybe." The laughter faded when she did not smile. The room became still. Through the tall windows, Boston Harbor reflected the fading afternoon light. A server outside the room stopped briefly before continuing down the hallway. Even Richard remained frozen near the door. Nathan leaned forward slightly. "What kind of pattern?" Claire's fingers tightened around the tray for the first time all afternoon. Not from fear, from memory. For a moment she seemed somewhere else entirely. Then she returned. The kind people stop seeing when they trust the summary more than the details. Nobody spoke. Nathan's grip on the water glass tightened slightly, not in anger, in thought. Across the table, one attorney quietly reopened a section he had already reviewed earlier. Another executive glanced down at a page he had ignored most of the afternoon. No one admitted it, but doubt had entered the room. Claire turned to leave. Then she stopped. Her eyes moved once toward the receipt, once toward the projection sheet beneath Nathan's phone. Finally, she looked directly at him. "Sir," she said softly. Nathan raised his eyes. "Yes?" Claire paused for only a second. If two numbers are supposed to tell the same story, they should not sound different when you read them. And, for the first time that afternoon, every person in the room looked back at the documents instead of the waitress. For several seconds after Claire spoke, nobody touched the documents. The room had not become convinced. It had become uncertain. There was a difference. Nathan Whitmore looked down at the projection sheet beneath his phone, then at the receipt near the edge of the table. He immediately disliked the fact that he was doing exactly what a waitress had prompted him to do. "Numbers do not tell stories," one executive said finally. "They tell facts." Claire was already turning toward the door. "Only if they are all being counted the same way." Her voice remained calm. No challenge, no arrogance. Yet the answer lingered longer than anyone expected. Nathan watched her leave. Across the table, the chief financial officer reopened a spreadsheet he had closed 20 minutes earlier. "There is nothing unusual here," he said, though his confidence sounded slightly thinner. Another attorney adjusted his glasses and reviewed a supporting schedule. Nobody found anything. Yet nobody returned to their previous certainty either. The meeting continued, but the rhythm felt different now. Questions became slower. Explanations became longer. Downstairs, Claire returned to work. She carried plates, refilled water glasses, smiled politely at guests, celebrating birthdays and business deals of their own. Yet the afternoon refused to leave her mind. While organizing invoices at the service station, she paused when she saw two totals printed from different systems. The amounts matched perfectly. The sight brought an unexpected memory. A kitchen table, a stack of folders. Her mother's tired voice saying, "When two reports describe the same thing differently, start asking why." Claire blinked and returned to work. The memory vanished, but the feeling remained. An hour later, she was called upstairs again. More coffee, more bottled water, more waiting. When she entered the private dining room, she immediately sensed the tension. Nobody was laughing now. One attorney was quietly reviewing appendices. Another was checking line items against reserve schedules. Nathan sat at the head of the table, silent. His pen rested untouched beside the contract. As Claire poured coffee, she noticed something small. The projection sheet beneath Nathan's phone had finally been moved. In its place sat two pages side by side. She did not read them. She only saw enough to recognize that someone else had started comparing numbers too. Nathan noticed where her eyes stopped. "Miss Bennett." She looked up. "Yes, sir?" "You seem unusually interested in accounting." Several executives glanced toward her again. The question was polite, but there was pressure beneath it. Claire considered her answer. "Not accounting." Nathan waited. "Patterns." A few people exchanged looks. Nathan leaned back slightly. "And where did you learn to recognize these patterns?" For the first time all afternoon, something crossed Claire's face. Not fear, not pride. Something closer to old disappointment. From people who paid dearly for ignoring them. The room grew quiet. Nathan studied her expression. That answer did not sound rehearsed. It sounded remembered. Claire picked up the empty coffee cups and prepared to leave. As she reached for the small receipt near the edge of the table, her fingers stopped for the briefest moment. Her eyes moved from the handwritten correction on the receipt to the two comparison pages now sitting in front of Nathan. Then she quietly set the receipt back down exactly where it had been. Nathan followed the movement. And suddenly, he realized something that unsettled him more than any missing figure ever could. Claire was not looking at the numbers themselves. She was looking at the way people were choosing to present them. Nathan Whitmore did not immediately return to the discussion after that realization. The attorneys continued reviewing schedules. Investors checked timelines. Assistants quietly exchanged revised pages. Yet Nathan's attention kept drifting back to the same question. Claire Bennett was not reacting to numbers the way someone impressed by business would react. She was reacting to behavior, to choices, to presentation. That distinction unsettled him. Across the table, the chief financial officer adjusted a spreadsheet and cleared his throat. The reserve structure remains within expected parameters. Another executive nodded. Everything still aligns with the annual model. Nathan listened. For the first time that afternoon, he found himself studying the people speaking instead of the figures on the page. Confidence sounded different when it was genuine. Downstairs, Claire continued her shift. Orders arrived. Guests left. New guests took their seats beside the harbor windows. Yet the tension upstairs followed her like a shadow. While organizing service receipts behind the host stand, she noticed a young employee struggling to reconcile two meal totals from separate systems. One says $243, the employee said. The other says $243 too. Claire looked briefly at the printouts. Do they reach that number the same way? The employee blinked. I do not know. Claire handed the papers back. Then start there. The employee stared at her for a second before walking away. Several minutes later, Richard approached. You always ask strange questions about numbers, Claire smiled faintly. Numbers are usually the easy part, Richard frowned. Then what is the hard part? Claire glanced toward the elevator leading to the private dining room. Understanding why people want them, arranged a certain way. Richard looked confused. Claire returned to work. By late afternoon, she was called upstairs again. The atmosphere inside the private room felt noticeably different. The urgency remained, but certainty had weakened. One attorney was now comparing multiple schedules side by side. Another had requested supporting documentation that had not seemed important earlier. Nathan sat quietly at the head of the table, his untouched coffee growing cold. As Claire refilled water glasses, she heard a phrase from one of the lawyers. The quarterly reserve appears accurate, another lawyer responded. Then why does the annual exposure feel low? Nobody answered immediately. Claire lowered her eyes. A memory surfaced without warning. She was 17, sitting beside her mother at a kitchen table covered in invoices after a transportation company collapsed. Her mother pointing to two reports and saying, when one page celebrates savings and another page quietly accepts losses, they are usually describing the same problem. The memory disappeared. Claire set down the final glass. Nathan noticed her expression change. Just slightly. Enough, Miss Bennett. She stopped. The room fell quiet again. Yes, sir? Nathan's voice was lower now, less certain than before. You have heard something like this before, have you not? Claire hesitated. Every person at the table watched her. She could feel it. The pressure, the curiosity, the disbelief. Finally, she nodded once. Not this deal. Nathan waited. Then what? Claire looked toward the comparison pages lying beside the small receipt at the edge of the table. Her answer came softly. A company that believed it had 1 year of risk when it was actually carrying several. The room became completely still. Nathan's expression changed, because for the first time all afternoon, he was no longer wondering whether Claire saw a problem. He was wondering how close she had once been to one. The room remained silent after Claire's answer. Nobody reached for a document. Nobody checked a phone. Even the attorneys seemed unwilling to break the moment. Nathan Whitmore stared at her across the table, trying to reconcile the woman carrying a coffee tray with the quiet certainty in her voice. Several years? He repeated. Claire nodded once. Yes, sir. Nathan leaned back slowly. What company? The question came before he could stop himself. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. For the first time that afternoon, she looked less like a waitress and more like someone carrying an old memory. A regional transportation company, she said. My mother's company. One attorney glanced up immediately. Another seemed to recognize the story before he recognized the name. Claire continued softly. They thought they had 12 months of exposure. It turned out they had much more. Nobody interrupted. The quarterly reports looked fine. The summaries looked fine. The presentation looked fine. Her gaze drifted toward the comparison pages on the table. The problem was never the numbers themselves. Nathan felt a strange discomfort settle in his chest. Then what was the problem? Claire looked directly at him. The timeline. The room became still again. One of the attorneys slowly turned back to the reserve schedule. Another reopened a supporting appendix. Nathan watched them. Nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was treating Claire like a curiosity. They were listening. "Miss Bennett," the chief financial officer said carefully, "what exactly are you seeing?" Claire hesitated. She did not step closer to the table. She did not touch the documents. She simply pointed toward the comparison pages beside the small receipt. "The reserve number is being discussed as if it belongs to 1 year." The attorney nearest the page frowned. "And?" Claire took a slow breath. "The language underneath describes obligations extending beyond that period." The attorney immediately looked down again. His eyes moved across several lines, then back, then forward once more. Nathan felt his pulse quicken, not from panic, from recognition. The attorney suddenly sat straighter. "Wait," another lawyer leaned over. "What is it?" The first attorney pointed to a section buried beneath the reserve assumptions. "The obligations roll forward." The second attorney blinked. "How long?" Nobody answered for several seconds. Then the chief financial officer quietly performed the calculation. His face lost color first. Not dramatically. Just enough. 9 quarters, he said. The room froze. Nathan looked from the schedule to the projections and back again. 9? The chief financial officer nodded. "The annual model only reflects part of the obligation." Nobody spoke. The harbor outside seemed impossibly distant. Claire remained standing near the doorway with her tray. She did not look triumphant. If anything, she looked sad. Nathan finally understood why. "How much?" he asked quietly. The chief financial officer swallowed. "Approximately $90 million. Silence. Real silence. The kind that arrives when a room realizes it almost made a very expensive mistake. Nathan lowered his eyes. Hours earlier, he had asked whether she could count. Now he was struggling to count the number of warnings he had ignored. One attorney slowly closed his folder. Another removed his glasses. Across the table, every executive seemed to be looking anywhere, except at Nathan. Claire turned toward the door. Her shift was still not over. She still had guests waiting downstairs. Before leaving, she glanced once at the small receipt resting beside the documents. Then she looked at Nathan. "The totals were never the same story," she said softly. And this time, nobody in the room doubted she had been right from the beginning. Nobody moved for several seconds after the number was spoken aloud. $90 million. The figure seemed too large to belong inside a quiet room overlooking Boston Harbor. Yet there it was, resting heavily between the people who had nearly approved it and the woman carrying a coffee tray. Nathan Whitmore slowly lowered his eyes to the documents spread across the table. For years, he had built a reputation on finding weaknesses before anyone else did. Investors trusted him because he was supposed to see what others missed. Yet this afternoon, the person who had protected him from a mistake had been the one person he had dismissed without hesitation. Around the room, the atmosphere changed in subtle ways. Attorneys who had barely acknowledged Claire earlier now looked toward her with curiosity. Executives who had smiled at Nathan's joke avoided eye contact altogether. The chief financial officer remained focused on the schedules in front of him, though his shoulders seemed heavier than before. Nobody said what they were thinking. They did not need to. The silence carried it. Claire stood near the doorway, holding her tray. She did not look victorious. She did not look proud. If anything, she appeared slightly uncomfortable with the attention. Nathan noticed that too. The people who craved recognition usually chased moments like this. Claire seemed eager to escape them. "We are suspending the closing," Nathan said finally. His voice was calm but firm. Several executives nodded immediately. Nobody argued. The decision felt inevitable now. One attorney began collecting documents, while another called the bank representatives, waiting for confirmation. Across the table, a few people quietly discussed revisions and risk assessments. Business was moving again. Yet Nathan remained still. His attention stayed fixed on the small restaurant receipt resting near the edge of the table. Hours earlier, it had been nothing. Now, it seemed strangely important. Not because of what it contained, because it reminded him how close he had come to trusting appearances more than judgment. Claire stepped forward and carefully picked up several empty coffee cups. "Miss Bennet," Nathan said. She paused. "Yes, sir?" The old confidence was gone from his voice. Not completely, but enough. "Why did you say anything?" The question surprised everyone, including him. Claire looked at the tray in her hands before answering. "Because someone should have." Nathan frowned slightly. "After the way I spoke to you?" Claire offered a small smile. "The numbers did not care how you spoke to me." A few people lowered their eyes. Nathan did the same. The answer carried no bitterness, no attempt to embarrass him. Somehow that made it harder to hear. For a moment he remembered the laughter, the question he had asked, the assumption he had made. Wealth had given him influence, information, and opportunities. It had not given him the right to underestimate people. Claire turned toward the door again. Her shift was still not finished. Guests downstairs still needed service. Life had not changed simply because a room full of wealthy people had learned a lesson. Nathan watched her walk several steps before stopping her one final time. "Miss Bennet." She looked back. The room grew quiet again. Nathan glanced at the documents, then at the receipt, then at the woman he had spent the entire afternoon misjudging. In that moment, he understood that the next decision had nothing to do with money, contracts, or risk exposure. It was about pride. He could pretend the discovery belonged to his team and protect his ego, or he could finally acknowledge the truth about who had seen it first. And for the first time that day, Nathan Whitmore was not sure which choice would be harder. The private dining room gradually emptied as evening settled over Boston Harbor. Attorneys gathered their folders. Executives made quiet phone calls. The urgency that had dominated the afternoon had disappeared, replaced by something slower and heavier. Reflection. One by one, people left the room until only a handful remained. Nathan Whitmore stood near the tall windows overlooking the water. The city lights were beginning to appear beyond the harbor, shimmering against the darkening sky. Behind him, the long table still held the traces of a day that had not gone according to plan. Empty coffee cups, half-finished notes, and near the edge of the table, the small restaurant receipt that had somehow become impossible for him to ignore. Claire Bennet returned a few minutes later to clear the room. Her shift was nearly over. She moved quietly between the chairs, collecting glasses and stacking plates with the same professionalism she had shown all afternoon. Nothing about her suggested she expected recognition. Nothing suggested she believed she had changed anyone's life. She was simply doing her job. Nathan watched her for several moments before finally speaking. "Miss Bennet." Claire looked up. "Yes, sir?" For the first time all day, he did not answer immediately. He had negotiated billion-dollar agreements, led difficult acquisitions, spoken before thousands of investors, yet finding the right words now felt strangely difficult. "I owe you an apology." The room became still. Richard, who was helping organize the remaining service items, paused without meaning to. Claire remained calm. "You do not owe me anything, sir." Nathan shook his head slightly. "That is not true." He glanced toward the harbor before continuing. "I decided who you were before I knew anything about you." Claire said nothing. Nathan continued. "I saw an apron and assumed I understood the person wearing it. The honesty in his voice surprised even him. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Claire smiled softly, not because she had won, because she understood. "Most people do," she said. Nathan lowered his eyes. Somehow, that answer carried more weight than anger ever could have. "That does not make it right." Claire nodded once. The silence that followed felt different from the others that day. Lighter, more human. Nathan reached into his jacket pocket and removed a business card. He placed it carefully on the table. "This is not charity." Claire glanced at it, but did not pick it up. "Then what is it?" Nathan allowed himself the faintest smile. "An invitation." She waited. "To what?" "A conversation." His voice remained steady. One where I listen before making assumptions. Claire looked at him for several seconds. Then her eyes moved briefly toward the small receipt still resting on the table. The paper seemed insignificant under the soft evening light. Yet neither of them looked at it the same way anymore. Finally, she picked up the business card. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the gesture. "I will think about it," she said. Nathan nodded. Somehow that answer felt earned. As Claire prepared to leave, Richard quietly opened the door for her. She stepped into the hallway and paused for a moment before looking back. Nathan was still standing by the window, no longer looking like the most powerful man in the room, just a man who had learned something important. Claire smiled gently and continued down the corridor. The door closed softly behind her. Nathan remained where he was, staring at the lights across the harbor. The deal could be replaced. $90 million could be protected. But the lesson would stay longer than either. Because sometimes the most valuable person in the room is the one nobody thinks to listen to. And true worth is never measured by the apron someone wears or the balance in their bank account.